On a silent winter night in a small town buried under snow, a man heard something most people would have driven past. It was not a cry, not a bark, just the faint sound of metal scraping against frozen ground. What he found behind an old fence would change two lives forever. This is not just a story about a dog. It is a story about guilt that lasts for decades, about choosing to stay when walking away is easier, and about a miracle that arrived without noise. Before the story begins, tell us where you are watching from today. Your city? Your country? Leave a comment so we can read it together. And if stories about kindness, second chances, and quiet miracles matter to you, please press subscribe to support the channel and walk this journey with us. Winter arrived early in Hawthorne Ridge, Montana, not with drama but with certainty. The town sat folded between low mountains and long pine lines, the kind of place where the road lights were spaced far apart and silence had learned to live comfortably with people. Snow fell in steady, disciplined sheets, pressing itself onto rooftops, mailboxes, and parked trucks, as if tucking the town in against something worse that might come later. The air smelled faintly of iron and cold sap. Sound traveled differently here in winter, muted, softened, forgiven almost as soon as it was made. Footsteps disappeared. Engines sighed instead of roared. Even grief, people like to believe, arrived quieter once the ground was white. Officer Daniel Cross was 62 years old, tall in the way men become when they have thinned but not weakened. His posture still disciplined from decades of habit. His hair was mostly silver now, cropped short not out of vanity but convenience, and his face bore the quiet geography of a life spent outdoors. Wind-worn skin, lines etched deep around the eyes and mouth. His eyes were a muted blue, steady and observant, the kind that rarely blinked first. Daniel had been a police officer in Hawthorne Ridge for 32 years, long enough that most residents no longer thought of him as authority so much as weather, reliable, familiar, occasionally unforgiving, but never surprising. He was known as a man who spoke little, listened carefully, and never raised his voice unless something had already gone very wrong. Since the death of his wife 4 winters earlier, a loss that had folded his life inward without breaking it, Daniel had become even quieter, carrying grief the way some men carried tools, carefully, privately, always within reach. That Christmas week, Daniel drove slower than usual. The cruiser's tires cut clean lines through fresh snow, lines that vanished behind him almost immediately. He had learned over the years that danger no longer announced itself the way it once did. It didn't shout. It didn't crash. It whispered. It waited for moments when attention wandered, when people trusted routine too much. His radio murmured low. Dispatch voices blurred into background texture. He was not responding to a call. He was simply driving, a habit he had never quite learned to turn off. That was when he heard it. At first, Daniel thought it was the cruiser itself, a loose panel, a protesting hinge, the subtle complaints of an aging vehicle. He eased off the accelerator. The sound came again, thin and metallic, cutting through the snow's soft hush like a wrong note held too long. He rolled down the window. Cold rushed in, sharp and immediate, stinging his cheeks and hands. He leaned slightly toward the open space, listening the way one listened for a heartbeat beneath thick blankets. The sound returned, clearer now. A scrape, a drag. Slow, uneven, out of rhythm. A chain, being pulled, inch by inch, across something frozen. Daniel stopped the cruiser. Behind a leaning wire fence, half buried and bowed under the weight of snow, stood a German Shepherd puppy. The dog was young, perhaps 8 months old by age, but his body told a harsher story. He was large for his age, yet somehow diminished. His frame stretched thin as if growth had occurred without nourishment. His coat, once black and tan, was dulled by frost and grime. Individual hairs stiffened into brittle clumps. His ribs hinted beneath the fur, not sharply enough to shock, but clearly enough to trouble. His legs were too thin for his size, trembling slightly, the way saplings do in winter wind. The chain wrapped twice around a metal post driven into the frozen ground, its length brutally short. When the puppy shifted, it tightened immediately, pulling his collar into the base of his neck. The collar itself was worn and ill-fitting, the leather cracked, the metal ring rimmed with rust. There was no proper shelter, just a cheap plastic doghouse, its roof fractured, its entrance facing the wrong direction, half buried in snow like a bad apology. The wind had easy access. So did the cold. The puppy did not bark. He did not growl or bare teeth or make any sound at all. Instead, he stood very still, his head lowering slowly, deliberately, until his gaze rested on the snow near Daniel's boots. His ears, once proud and upright, drooped slightly at the tips, betraying exhaustion more than fear. His eyes were dark brown, large, and unnervingly calm, carrying none of the frantic pleading Daniel had seen in abandoned animals before. This was not a dog who expected rescue. This was a dog who had learned that effort cost energy, and energy was precious. Daniel felt something settle heavily in his chest, an old weight he recognized too well. Memory, arriving without invitation. Another winter, years ago, another road, another dog he had noticed and cataloged and driven past because it hadn't been his place, because the law had been vague, because life had been busy. He remembered justifying it with procedure, with policy, with the quiet lie that someone else would handle it. That memory had stayed with him longer than some arrests, longer than some friendships. He stood there now, boots sinking slightly into snow, breath fogging the air, watching the puppy's chest rise and fall in shallow, controlled movements. The chain shifted as the dog tried to adjust his stance, metal scraping softly again, obedient to physics and cruelty alike. Daniel did not move closer yet. He had learned, both as an officer and as a man, that sudden kindness could be as frightening as sudden violence. Easy, he murmured, the word barely audible, more habit than strategy. The puppy lifted his eyes just enough to acknowledge the sound, then lowered them again. No tail wag, no retreat, just endurance. Daniel straightened slowly, his joints complaining in familiar ways, and looked around the yard. It was modest, unremarkable. A small house set back from the road, paint peeling at the edges, windows dark. There were no lights on, no movement inside. Snow had already begun to cover old footprints, erasing evidence of recent human presence. The town around them felt far away, insulated by weather and indifference. Daniel exhaled, a long breath that carried more than air. He knew, with a clarity that surprised him, that something had already shifted. This moment had weight. It would not be filed away neatly. It would follow him home. It would ask something of him. He looked at the puppy again, at the way the chain limited even the smallest turn of his head, at the quiet dignity with which the animal bore it. The law, Daniel knew, would have opinions about this. So would procedure. So would the town. But none of that spoke as loudly as the sound he had heard beneath the snow. Not this time, he thought, without drama or anger. Just resolve. Not this time. Snow continued to fall through the afternoon in Hawthorne Ridge, Montana, steady and unspectacular, the kind of snow that did not announce disaster but created it slowly through neglect. The town moved at its winter pace, gas station lights glowing pale yellow against the white, pickup trucks parked crooked along Main Street, windows fogged from breath and coffee. The mountains beyond the town limits were already fading into a single gray mass, their edges softened until sky and earth appeared undecided about where one ended and the other began. Officer Daniel Cross drove away from the fence with a pressure in his chest that refused to loosen. His cruiser followed the road like a reluctant animal, tires whispering over snowpack. He told himself he was doing what the law required. He told himself that experience mattered more than impulse. These were sentences he had repeated for decades, sentences that usually worked. Today, they rang hollow. The image of the puppy lingered with an unwelcome clarity. The German Shepherd's posture had not been dramatic. No frantic lunging, no desperate barking. Just a stillness that suggested long practice, as though the dog had learned that resistance only wasted strength. Daniel had seen that look before, not in animals, but in people. In suspects who had stopped explaining. In widowers after the casseroles stopped coming. In himself, some mornings. He parked the cruiser outside a modest single-story house on the edge of town. His house, one of several built decades earlier for working families who never imagined retiring anywhere else. The yard was neat but bare, the grass long surrendered to winter. A porch light flickered on automatically as he approached, illuminating the steps and the thin layer of snow already collecting there. Daniel stood for a moment before unlocking the door, his hand resting on the cold metal, listening to the quiet hum of the town settling in for the night. Inside, the house smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old wood. It was warm, orderly, almost too quiet. Daniel removed his coat carefully, hung it on the same hook he had used for years, and set his hat beside it. His movements were precise, economical, habits refined by years of living alone. On the small table near the entryway sat a cardboard box sealed with yellowed tape. Christmas ornaments. His late wife's handwriting still marked one side in black ink, the letters neat and slightly slanted. Daniel did not open the box. He rarely did. Some things were easier to acknowledge from a distance. He poured himself a cup of coffee he did not want and sat at the kitchen table, the mug warming his hands. Outside, wind began to rise, pushing snow sideways now, rattling the window frames. The sound slipped under the door, found its way into corners. Daniel imagined the puppy again, the way the chain had scraped faintly over frozen ground, the sound too small to be heard unless someone had slowed down enough to notice. He imagined the metal stiffening as temperatures dropped, imagined the collar biting into skin already rubbed raw. He checked the time. Animal control would not respond unless there was immediate danger. Hypothermia counted, eventually, but the thresholds were technical, debated, often determined after the fact. Daniel knew the man who owned the dog, Harold Vick. Late 50s, average height, thin to the point of appearing unfinished, with a perpetually tired face and shoulders that sagged, even when standing still. Harold was not known as a violent man. He was known as a man who let things slide. Fences unrepaired, bills unpaid, responsibilities postponed until they became permanent. The kind of man who did not kick a dog, but did not save one either. Daniel had knocked on Harold's door earlier that evening. Harold had answered slowly, as though surprised to find someone on the other side. He wore a flannel shirt faded almost to gray, and jeans stiff with wear, his hair thinning and uncombed, his face unshaven but not dirty. His eyes had been pale, unfocused, drifting past Daniel's shoulder more than meeting his gaze. When Daniel asked about the dog, Harold shrugged. "Guard dog," he had said. "Didn't like him inside. Didn't have money for a vet." The words were delivered without malice, without defense. Just facts, presented as immovable as weather. Daniel had explained the concerns calmly, professionally, his tone measured, non-confrontational. He had mentioned the cold, the chain length, the lack of shelter. Harold had listened with the distant politeness of someone waiting for a conversation to end. When Daniel asked if he would consider bringing the dog inside overnight, Harold shook his head once, slow and final. Said the dog was used to it. Said he had survived summer. Said he would survive winter too. Daniel had nodded then, thanked him, and left. Because escalation required authority he did not have in that moment. Because forcing the issue would close doors he might need open later. Because the law, written by people far from frozen yards, demanded patience. Now, sitting at his kitchen table, Daniel felt that patience wrought into something else. He stood, restless, moving through the house as though checking for something out of place. Everything was where it should be. The clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, the wind grew more insistent. Daniel paused by the living room window and looked out at the street, empty and white. The town lights glowed faintly through the snow, halos blurred by motion. He told himself he was off duty. The phrase had weight in his career. It meant rest. It meant boundaries. It meant knowing when to step back so others could step in. But the phrase had never meant indifference. It had never meant turning away when something was wrong simply because the clock said so. Daniel retrieved his coat. He moved deliberately now, pulling on layers, lacing boots, each action steady, practiced. He checked his flashlight, slid it into his pocket, and paused briefly at the door. For a moment, the memory of his wife surfaced unbidden. Her voice, practical and warm, reminding him to eat, to sleep, to not take the weight of the world home every night. He smiled faintly, a gesture that surprised him with its ease, and then opened the door. The cold hit him harder this time. Snow had begun to drive sideways, fine needles stinging exposed skin. He stepped onto the porch, locked the door behind him, and walked back to the cruiser. The engine turned over without complaint. The heater took its time. As Daniel drove back toward the edge of town, the road grew less defined, snow filling in lines, softening curves. His headlights carved narrow tunnels through the storm. He slowed further, aware that urgency did not excuse recklessness. He had learned that lesson early in his career, one winter night when haste had nearly cost him more than pride. The fence appeared again, leaning more heavily now under accumulating snow. Daniel parked and cut the engine. For a moment, he sat listening. Wind dominated the soundscape, a low, constant roar. Beneath it, faint but present, was the scrape. Slower now, more labored. Daniel stepped out. The yard was already transformed, drifts rising against the fence, the post nearly obscured. The puppy was still there, his form partially buried, his fur soaked through. He trembled continuously, not violently, but persistently, muscles locked in a losing battle against the cold. One back leg was caught awkwardly under the chain, forcing him into an unnatural stance. The collar had rubbed the fur away along one side of his neck, skin visible beneath, angry and red even in the dim light. The puppy did not cry out when Daniel approached. He did not attempt to flee. When Daniel knelt several feet away, careful not to startle him, the dog's head lifted slightly, eyes glassy but alert. There was no accusation in that gaze. No hope either. Just endurance. "It's all right," Daniel said softly, though he did not know if it was true yet. The wind pushed snow into Daniel's collar, down his sleeves. He reached out slowly, stopping if the dog stiffened, moving again when he relaxed. His hand brushed the chain, metal painfully cold even through gloves. He followed it with his eyes to the post, measuring distances, angles, options. He knew he could not legally remove the dog without authority. He also knew that waiting might mean there would be nothing left to remove. Headlights appeared in the distance, diffuse through the storm. Animal control, responding after all. Daniel felt a tension he had not fully acknowledged release slightly. He stayed where he was, between the dog and the wind, his body forming a partial shield. When the truck pulled up, its logo barely visible beneath snow, a woman stepped out. She was in her early 40s, bundled heavily, her build sturdy, practical. Her name was Ellen Price, Senior Animal Control Officer for the county, known for her competence and her refusal to sugarcoat reality. Her face was lined more by weather than age, her expression alert, professional. She took in the scene quickly, efficiently. "This qualifies," she said simply, voice raised over the wind. Daniel nodded. They worked without drama. Harold was contacted. He arrived reluctantly, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. When presented with the situation, with documentation, with the clear risk now undeniable, he did not argue. He signed the release with a shaking hand, relief evident in the slump of his posture once it was done. As Ellen prepared the transport crate, she asked for a name. Daniel looked down at the dog, at the way he leaned faintly into the space Daniel occupied, as if proximity itself were warmth. "Caleb," Daniel said, the name arriving without effort. The puppy did not react. He did not need to. The storm swallowed the sound anyway. Christmas night did not arrive gently in Hawthorne Ridge. It came on the back of wind that howled through the mountain passes and spilled into town like something alive, something searching. Snow no longer fell in quiet layers but drove sideways, thin and sharp, stinging skin and stealing breath. Streetlights blurred into pale orbs, their light swallowed almost as quickly as it appeared. The town, already subdued by winter, folded further into itself, doors shut tight, windows glowing faintly with television light and muted holiday music. Daniel Cross stood beside the animal control truck as Ellen Price secured the crate in the back. The metal rattled softly with each gust of wind, a hollow sound that seemed too loud in the white darkness. Ellen worked with brisk efficiency, her movements practiced, her face set in focused calm. She had the posture of someone accustomed to working when others slept, shoulders squared against weather and circumstance alike. Though bundled heavily, she moved with confidence, checking latches twice, tugging straps until satisfied. Christmas meant little in her line of work. Animals did not schedule suffering around holidays. Caleb lay inside the crate, curled as tightly as his body allowed. Now that he was no longer anchored to the post, his exhaustion showed more clearly. His breathing was shallow but steady, each rise of his chest visible through matted fur. The raw place on his neck looked angrier in the artificial light, skin inflamed and damp. One back leg trembled intermittently, not with panic but with fatigue, muscles firing and failing in uneven rhythm. He did not resist the crate. He did not whine. He simply endured, as though movement itself had become optional. Daniel watched him closely, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. At 62, Daniel's face rarely betrayed what he felt, but tonight something tight sat behind his eyes, a pressure he had not experienced in years. He had spent his career standing at the edges of other people's crises, trained to observe, to manage, to intervene only when protocol allowed. This was different. This was smaller, quieter, and somehow heavier. "You did the right thing," Ellen said, raising her voice slightly over the wind. Her tone was practical rather than comforting, but there was no doubt she meant it. She glanced at Daniel, her eyes sharp, taking in his rigid posture. He wouldn't have made it through the night. Daniel nodded once. He did not trust his voice yet. The owner, Harold Vick, stood several feet away, hands buried in his jacket sleeves, shoulders hunched against the cold. Snow clung to his boots and the hem of his jeans. He looked smaller now, diminished by the scene, by the attention, by the undeniable reality of what had nearly happened. When Ellen handed him the copy of the release form, he accepted it without comment, folding the paper carefully as though it might cut him if mishandled. He did not look at the crate again. He muttered a vague apology to no one in particular and retreated toward his house, disappearing into the storm without ceremony. Ellen climbed into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life. She leaned out the window briefly. "We're taking him to the county intake first," she said. "Vet's on call, but we'll assess en route. You want to follow?" Daniel hesitated only a fraction of a second. "Yes." The road out of town was barely visible now. Snow had erased landmarks, leaving only suggestion and memory to guide drivers. Daniel followed the truck at a careful distance, headlights cutting twin tunnels through the dark. The radio crackled occasionally with weather advisories, warnings about closures and drifting snow, but Daniel barely registered them. His attention stayed fixed on the red taillights ahead, on the knowledge that a living thing lay between them, fragile and stubborn, alive by narrow margins. The county intake facility sat several miles outside town, a low utilitarian building surrounded by fencing and half-buried vehicles. Its lights were on despite the hour, harsh and unadorned, casting long shadows across the snow. Christmas decorations were notably absent. Inside, warmth hit Daniel immediately, thick and almost overwhelming after the cold. The smell was antiseptic, layered with animal and metal, and something faintly medicinal. The sounds were muted, occasional barks, the hum of ventilation, the soft echo of footsteps on concrete floors. Ellen and a technician Daniel did not recognize moved quickly. The technician was a young man in his late 20s, average height and build, with dark hair cropped short and a perpetually concerned expression. His name tag read Marcus. He spoke quietly, efficiently, his hands gentle as he opened the crate and assessed Caleb's condition. Marcus's demeanor suggested someone who had learned early that animals responded better to calm than pity. Caleb did not resist being lifted. His body went limp with exhaustion, weight settling into Marcus's arms as though gravity itself had increased. Daniel noticed how light he felt, how little resistance there was, and something in his chest tightened further. The raw skin on Caleb's neck was cleaned quickly, wrapped loosely. A thermometer slid into place, numbers read aloud in clipped tones. Hypothermia, not yet severe but trending. Dehydration, muscle strain, possible joint involvement in the back leg. "He's young," Marcus said quietly. More observation than reassurance. That helps. They placed Caleb on a padded surface beneath a heat lamp. The dog's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused, then closed again. His breathing steadied marginally as warmth seeped back into him. Daniel stood back, aware of his size, his presence, unwilling to crowd the space. He clasped his hands behind his back, an old habit, and watched. Ellen filled out paperwork nearby, her pen moving decisively. When she asked for the dog's name again, Daniel repeated it. Caleb. She wrote it down without comment, the letters blocky and clear. Minutes stretched. The storm outside battered the building, wind pressing against walls, snow rattling against windows. Inside, time felt suspended, measured in heartbeats and small adjustments. Daniel found himself studying details he would normally overlook. The slight rise and fall of Caleb's chest, the way one ear twitched occasionally, the steady glow of the heat lamp casting amber light over black and tan fur. For the first time since the night began, Caleb made a sound. It was not a bark or a whine, just a low, almost imperceptible exhale that carried with it something like release. Daniel realized he had been holding his own breath and forced himself to let it go. Stay with him, Ellen said quietly as she gathered her things. I'll finish the intake. Vet will see him soon. Daniel did not question the instruction. He moved closer, careful, and sat on a low bench beside the table. He did not touch Caleb yet. He simply sat, present, a steady shape in the room. Years of experience told him that presence mattered more than action sometimes, that being there consistently was its own form of protection. Outside, somewhere far beyond the walls, church bells rang faintly, carried on the wind, marking midnight. Christmas Day had arrived, unnoticed by most of the town. Daniel listened to the sound fade and thought of the box of ornaments still unopened in his hallway, of traditions suspended but not erased. He thought of the chain, now left behind, buried under snow, rusting in silence. Caleb's eyes opened again, briefly, clouded but aware. They found Daniel's face and held there for a second longer than before. There was no recognition yet, no trust, but there was acknowledgement. Daniel offered a small nod, as if greeting an equal. You're safe for now, he said softly. The words meant as much for himself as for the dog. Caleb's eyes closed once more. The storm raged on, indifferent to small victories. But inside the county intake building, under harsh lights and watchful eyes, something fragile held its ground. Christmas night passed not with celebration, but with vigilance, warmth, and the quiet refusal to let another life slip away unnoticed. Morning arrived quietly, as if unsure it was welcome. Snow still fell over Hawthorne Ridge, but without the anger of the night before. It drifted down in fine, unhurried flakes, settling into the scars left by the storm and smoothing them over. The town emerged cautiously, plows moving like patient animals, windows lighting one by one, smoke lifting from chimneys in thin gray ribbons. Christmas morning, subdued and pale, held its breath. Daniel Cross had not slept. He sat in the hard plastic chair beside the examination room at the county veterinary clinic, his coat folded neatly over his arm, hands resting on his knees. At 62, his body felt every hour he stayed awake now, but fatigue had become a familiar companion, one he tolerated without complaint. His eyes followed every movement inside the room beyond the glass panel. Every shift of shadow, every indistinct shape that might be Caleb. The clinic itself was modest but well kept, designed for function rather than comfort. The floors were spotless, the walls painted a neutral beige meant to calm both animals and people. The smell of antiseptic lingered everywhere, sharp but clean. A small artificial Christmas tree stood in the corner of the waiting area, undecorated except for a single strand of white lights that blinked unevenly, as if uncertain about celebration. Dr. Margaret Lowell entered the room shortly after sunrise. She was in her early 50s, tall and spare, with iron gray hair pulled into a practical bun. Years of veterinary work had given her a posture that balanced authority with patience. and her voice carried a steadiness that suggested she had delivered both hope and heartbreak countless times. Her face bore the fine lines of someone who smiled often but did not waste the gesture. She greeted Daniel with a nod, recognizing him immediately. In small towns, roles overlapped. She had treated his wife's aging cat years ago. She remembered his quiet gratitude. "Caleb's stable," she said, without preamble. "That's the first thing." Daniel exhaled, the breath leaving him more shakily than he intended. Dr. Lowell explained the rest with clinical clarity. Months of chaining during critical growth had left their mark. Neck strain from constant tension on the collar. Early joint damage, particularly in the hind leg that had been pinned awkwardly overnight. Muscle atrophy where movement had been restricted. Nothing dramatic enough to shock the eye, but cumulative, insidious, the kind of harm that revealed itself slowly over time. "He'll live," she said again, meeting Daniel's gaze, but gently. No sudden demands, no expectations he hasn't earned the strength to meet. Daniel nodded. He understood gentleness. It was something he had learned late, at cost. Caleb lay on a padded mat nearby, wrapped loosely in a thermal blanket. His fur had been cleaned, though patches still lay flattened where dirt and moisture had worked deep. The raw skin on his neck was dressed carefully, the redness already less angry than the night before. His eyes were open now, tracking movement without panic. When Daniel stepped closer, Caleb did not retreat. He did not advance either. He simply watched, head low, ears half back, body still. "He doesn't trust rooms yet," Dr. Lowell observed quietly. "That may take time." Trust, Daniel thought, was always the slowest part. By mid-morning, arrangements were made. Because Daniel had been the reporting officer, and because no foster placement was immediately available on Christmas Day, Caleb was released temporarily into Daniel's care under supervision, pending further evaluation. The paperwork was thorough, procedural, familiar. Daniel signed where indicated, his handwriting steady, precise. The drive back to town felt different. Caleb lay in the back of the cruiser on a thick blanket, unrestrained but watched closely through the rearview mirror. He did not attempt to stand. He did not explore. He stayed where he was placed, his body curled inward, conserving energy. When the cruiser turned, he shifted slightly to maintain balance, then settled again. Daniel drove slower than ever, avoiding potholes, braking early. His awareness stretched thin over every mile. Daniel's house greeted them with quiet warmth. He opened the door carefully, holding it wide, allowing Caleb to see the space before entering. The dog paused at the threshold, nostrils flaring slightly, taking in unfamiliar scents. Wood, old coffee, detergent, something faintly floral left behind by memory. He did not cross the line until Daniel stepped inside first and waited. Inside, the house was unchanged. Orderly, sparse, functional. Caleb moved just far enough to be out of the doorway and then stopped, standing uncertainly, as if expecting the walls to close in. Daniel removed his coat and boots slowly, deliberately, narrating his actions in a low voice without thinking about it. "All right, easy. Just taking this off." Caleb flinched when fabric shifted too quickly, when a sleeve brushed the air with a sudden sound. Daniel noticed immediately and adjusted, slowing further, movements becoming almost ceremonial. He guided Caleb gently toward the living room, not pulling, not pushing, simply indicating space. Caleb chose the spot closest to the door. He lay down there, curled tightly, his back to the wall, eyes fixed on the exit. It was not comfort he sought, but control. Escape routes mattered more than cushions. Daniel let him be. They lived that day quietly. Daniel prepared soft food as instructed, placing the bowl a careful distance away and stepping back. Caleb approached cautiously, sniffed, retreated once, then returned. He ate slowly, methodically, pausing often as if expecting interruption. Daniel sat at the table and pretended not to watch, though every movement was catalogued. Sounds startled Caleb most. The refrigerator's hum drew a tense glance. The creak of a floorboard froze him mid-step. When Daniel raised his voice to answer a ringing phone, Caleb dropped flat to the floor, muscles locked, breath shallow. Daniel ended the call quickly, then lowered himself to sit several feet away, not touching, just present, until the tension ebbed. Night came early. Christmas lights from neighboring houses cast faint color through the windows, reds and greens softened by falling snow. Daniel turned on only one lamp, keeping the rest of the house dim. He moved slowly, spoke softly. His own presence recalibrated around the fragile nervous system now sharing his space. When nightmares came, they came without warning. Caleb's body stiffened, legs twitching, breath hitching. A low sound escaped his throat, barely audible but unmistakably distressed. Daniel woke instantly, years of training responding before thought. He did not reach for the dog immediately. He sat on the floor a short distance away, speaking calmly, steadily, until the tremors eased. It took time. It always did. Eventually, Caleb's breathing evened out. His eyes opened, unfocused, then slowly found Daniel's shape in the dim light. He did not move closer. He did not retreat. He simply remained, anchored by presence rather than touch. Trust arrived in inches, not leaps. By morning, snow had eased again. The town resumed its quiet rhythm. Daniel brewed coffee and hummed softly without realizing it. An old carol drifting out of tune and back again. Caleb listened from his place by the door, ears twitching slightly, as if sound itself mattered now, as if it carried information worth keeping. They were not healed. Nothing was fixed. But they were safe. And sometimes, Daniel thought, that was the hardest work of all. The snow softened as the week edged forward, as though winter itself were reconsidering its severity. Hawthorne Ridge settled into a quieter rhythm after Christmas, decorations dimmed but still glowing faintly in windows, wreaths sagging under accumulated frost. The town felt paused, suspended between celebration and the long stretch of cold that followed it. Daniel Cross noticed these small shifts the way he noticed everything now, with careful attention, without comment. Caleb noticed them too, in his own way. By the fifth day, he had begun to move farther from the door, inch by cautious inch. He still slept closest to it, his body aligned as if ready to flee. But during the day, he ventured into the living room, nose low, ears tracking sound. His limp was subtle but present, more pronounced on cold mornings, easing slightly after short, careful walks. Daniel followed the veterinarian's instructions to the letter. Gentle living. Nothing sudden. No expectations that had not earned their place. Trust, fragile and easily startled, had begun to sketch itself into the space between them. The call came on a gray afternoon, the sky low and heavy with promise of more snow. It was Ellen Price from Animal Control. Her voice carried the same practical calm as always. A family had expressed interest. They had read the report. They understood there were limitations. Would Daniel be willing to host a meeting? Daniel hesitated, the phone cool against his ear. He looked at Caleb, who lay near the window now, chin resting on crossed paws, watching flakes drift down with something like curiosity. Yes, Daniel said finally. We can do it here. He spent the next hour preparing in ways he did not fully recognize as preparation. He vacuumed, though the house was already clean. He moved furniture slightly, creating more open space. He set out water, then moved it again, unsure where it belonged. When he realized what he was doing, he stopped, standing still in the middle of the room, hands resting at his sides. He reminded himself that this was not an audition. It was an introduction. The family arrived just after noon. There were 4 of them. Mark and Allison Green, both in their late 30s, dressed in practical winter clothes that suggested comfort rather than display. Mark was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements easy, athletic, the kind of man who took up space without seeming to try. His hair was dark, his expression open, eyes quick to smile. Allison was slightly shorter, slim, her posture relaxed but attentive. She had the look of someone used to managing many small details at once, her gaze warm but assessing. Their children, Emma and Luke, stood close to their parents at first. Emma, 10, with light brown hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, eyes bright with curiosity. Luke, 8, quieter, his hands tucked into his jacket sleeves, watching more than speaking. Daniel greeted them at the door, his manner polite, reserved. He had learned long ago that friendliness did not require familiarity. Caleb watched from several feet away, his body angled sideways, ready to retreat if needed. He did not bark. He did not growl. He observed. "This is Caleb," Daniel said simply. Emma took a step forward instinctively, then stopped herself, glancing at her parents. Allison nodded, encouraging restraint. "He's beautiful," she said softly. Caleb flicked an ear at the sound of her voice but did not move closer. They sat together in the living room, the conversation careful at first. Mark asked practical questions: age, size, feeding schedule. Allison asked about temperament, triggers, what Caleb seemed to enjoy. Daniel answered honestly, precisely, his words chosen with care. He did not embellish. He did not minimize. "He was chained for months," Daniel said, meeting their eyes. "During a critical growth period. He's improving, but there are things that may never fully resolve." He explained the limp, the sensitivity to sudden sound, the way Caleb startled when voices rose unexpectedly, the need for patience measured not in days or weeks, but in habits built slowly over time. Emma listened intently, her hands clasped in her lap. Luke leaned forward slightly, curiosity overcoming caution. "Can he run?" Luke asked quietly. "Not like other dogs," Daniel replied. "Not without pain." There was a moment of silence. It was not uncomfortable, but it was weighted. Caleb shifted, moving closer to Daniel's chair, his head brushing against Daniel's boot before settling there. The contact was light, almost accidental, but it held. Daniel felt it immediately, the warmth, the trust implied in the choice. He kept his expression neutral, but something inside him tightened. Allison noticed. Her gaze softened, then flickered briefly to Mark. They shared a look, one of those silent exchanges built from years of shared decisions. "We like to hike," Mark said after a moment. "Long trails. The kids are active. We were hoping for a dog who could keep up." Daniel nodded. He had expected this. He had rehearsed this conversation without knowing it. "Caleb would want to try," he said quietly. "But wanting doesn't change what his body can handle." Emma shifted closer to Allison, her enthusiasm tempered by the tone of the room. "He could stay home with Mom," she offered earnestly. Allison smiled at her, then looked back at Daniel. "We'd never want to hurt him by asking too much," she said. It was not an excuse. It was a truth. They spent another half-hour together. The children offered Caleb treats under Daniel's guidance, palms open, movement slow. Caleb accepted, carefully, retreating a step afterward as if to recenter himself. He tolerated being observed. He did not invite touch. When the family stood to leave, their smiles were still kind. But quieter now. They thanked Daniel sincerely, expressing admiration for his care. "We need to think about what's best," Mark said. "For him and for us." Daniel walked them to the door. Outside, snow began to fall again, light and persistent. That night, the house felt different. Caleb chose his spot by the door as usual, but after Daniel settled into his chair, the dog shifted, stood, and crossed the room. He rested his head against Daniel's boot and stayed there, the weight unmistakable, deliberate. Daniel froze, afraid that movement would break something fragile. He looked down at the dark curve of Caleb's head, at the ears relaxed but alert. In that quiet, something surfaced with clarity sharp enough to sting. Sending Caleb away, to a good home, to kind people, would still be a loss. It would still echo the sound of a chain dragged away, replaced by absence. Daniel had spent his life believing that doing the right thing always meant stepping back, letting go, making room for others. But some forms of letting go, he realized now, were simply abandonment dressed in better clothes. The phone rang the next morning. Ellen's voice was gentle but direct. "They've decided not to move forward," she said. "They think Caleb deserves a home that fits his needs better." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Thank you for telling me." He hung up and stood in the quiet kitchen, sunlight filtering through frost-lined windows. Caleb watched from the doorway, ears lifting slightly at the change in energy. Daniel knelt slowly and rested a hand near the dog, not touching, just there. He was not ready yet to name what he felt. But he knew, with unsettling certainty, that something irreversible had already begun. The morning after the call broke clear and cold, the kind of winter morning that felt honest about what it was. Snow lay undisturbed across Hawthorne Ridge, smooth and pale, reflecting light back into the sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that made even familiar places feel newly revealed. Daniel Cross stood at his kitchen window with a mug of coffee cooling between his hands, watching his breath fog the glass as he exhaled slowly. Caleb lay near the doorway, his usual place, though his body no longer pressed as tightly against the threshold as it once had. His posture had softened over time, the sharp readiness to flee easing into something closer to awareness. When Daniel shifted his weight, Caleb lifted his head, ears flicking, eyes following. He did not rise. He did not retreat. He simply watched, present. Daniel had spent most of his adult life believing that duty was about distance. You did your job. You followed the rules. You handed things off when it was time. You did not cling. You did not insert yourself where others might belong better. That belief had shaped his career, his marriage, even his grief. It had served him well most of the time. But now, standing in his quiet kitchen with a dog who had learned pain before safety, Daniel understood something that unsettled him deeply. Sometimes duty was not about stepping back. Sometimes it was about staying. The paperwork took less time than he expected. The county office smelled faintly of dust and toner, the floors scuffed by decades of boots and winter shoes. Ellen Price met him there, her expression neutral but knowing. She did not congratulate him. She did not make a speech. She simply slid the forms across the counter and waited. Daniel read every line. He always did. Permanent adoption, full responsibility, medical care, long-term planning. No assumptions about improvement beyond what time and gentleness could reasonably offer. He signed without shaking. When Ellen stamped the final page, the sound echoed more loudly than it should have in the small office. Daniel felt it settle somewhere inside him, not as relief, but as weight. Solid, chosen, and real. "Take care of him," Ellen said simply. Daniel nodded. "I will." Spring did not arrive all at once. It came the way trust had, with small allowances. Snow melted in narrow channels along sidewalks. Icicles shortened day by day. Mud replaced ice, then grass pushed through in stubborn patches. The town changed its sounds before it changed its color. Water ran. Birds tested the air. Doors stayed open longer. Caleb felt the seasons in his body. Cold mornings still made him stiff, his limp more noticeable, until movement eased it into something manageable. Daniel adjusted their walks accordingly, shorter, slower, always on the same route at first, the same block, the same turns. Predictability became a language they both spoke fluently. Caleb's confidence grew not in leaps but in quiet permissions. He ventured farther into the house now, claiming a corner of the living room as his own. He learned the rhythms of Daniel's mornings, the sound of the coffee maker, the cadence of footsteps that meant breakfast was coming. He startled less often. When he did, recovery came faster. Daniel changed too, though less visibly. He found himself speaking more, narrating small tasks aloud, not because Caleb needed the information, but because the act of speaking softened the space between them. He hummed while making coffee, sang badly while folding laundry. The house, once a museum of restraint, began to feel lived in again. They walked every afternoon. Neighbors noticed. They always did in Hawthorne Ridge. A man and his dog, moving slowly, deliberately, regardless of weather. Some waved, some stopped to chat. Daniel did not rush those conversations anymore. He let them happen. Caleb stood quietly at his side, leaning slightly into Daniel's leg when unfamiliar voices lingered too long. By the following winter, the chain had become an object rather than a memory. Daniel found it while cleaning the shed one afternoon, rusted and stiff. Links, fused together by neglect and time. He held it for a long moment, weighing it in his hands. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more than metal. That Christmas Eve, Daniel brought the ornament box down from the shelf. He opened it carefully, lifting out each fragile piece wrapped in yellowed paper. Memories surfaced without pain now, just presence. Laughter. Quiet evenings. Traditions paused but not erased. He selected one ornament only, a small broken chain, cleaned, polished just enough to catch the light, its ends separated permanently. He hung it on the tree himself. Caleb watched from the rug, head tilted slightly, ears alert but relaxed. When Daniel stepped back, the ornament swayed gently, reflecting the lights in fractured patterns. It made no sound. Later that night, as snow fell again outside the windows, Daniel sat in his chair with a book he did not read. Caleb lay nearby, stretched out comfortably, his body loose, his breathing slow and deep. When Daniel reached down without looking, Caleb did not flinch. He shifted closer. Daniel rested his hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling warmth and muscle and the steady proof of life. He thought of all the years he had believed that miracles were loud things. Sirens, shouts, last-second rescues that left no doubt behind. He had learned differently now. Miracles did not arrive loudly. Sometimes they simply stayed. At the end of this story, we are reminded of a simple truth. God does not always send miracles with thunder or signs in the sky. Sometimes his miracles come quietly through compassion, through a moment when someone chooses to stop, to listen, to stay. In our daily lives, we pass many chances to be that miracle for someone else, a neighbor, a stranger, an animal, a soul that feels forgotten. This story teaches us that love is not proven by grand gestures but by patience and presence. If this message touched your heart, please share this story so it can reach someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us what this story meant to you. If you believe that God still works through kindness and second chances, please comment Amen. May God bless you and your family with peace, protection, and quiet miracles in your own life. And if you have not yet subscribed, please press subscribe to support our YouTube channel so we can continue sharing stories of faith, hope, and love with you.